I said for a long time there are two things you can always find on Marketplace or Craigslist for nearly or actually free anytime, and that's hot tubs and pool tables. Hot tubs are always accessible because most people underestimate the required interseasonal maintenance, but the pool tables are a different story. I think the reason they're so available online is because folks realize just how big of a space commitment they are, and they get bored with them eventually. And the buying pool is equally aware. Folks looking to buy a pool table know how much space they take, and they know they ain't got it. For folks like me that own a single-story, single-family home built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to cater to the baby boom, room sizes aren't really well built for holding a pool table. What if I told you it didn't have to be that way? My name is Ty. These are my theories. More specifically, this is my pool table. This is a Playmaster Barbox pool table that I got on Facebook Marketplace for just $30. And while the real meat of the story starts there, I want to take a few moments to talk about how I viewed the game of pool for the first 30 or so years of my life. And I also want to preemptively make a futile attempt to thank Scott Crosby for his ideas and his inspiration and how they helped me make this pool table happen. Growing up, there were two truths to the game of pool to me that made me feel like the game was inaccessible. The first of which was that it was a game for adults. As a kid, at first I wasn't tall enough to even see the table, let alone play, but the grown-ups around me could play no problem. Once I got a little taller, a little older, I remember being in the Wheatland, Wyoming Moose Lodge during a vacation trip to visit my grandma and my great-grandma. There was a pool table in the bar that I probably wasn't even supposed to be in. And I asked probably my mom if my brother and I could play a game of pool. And the answer was no, you'll scratch the cloth. At the time, I didn't know what it meant, but it seemed that despite being tall enough to now see the table, there was some yet unlearned skill or finesse that would come with being a grown-up. To be learned at a later date that would let me finally play pool. I feel like the first time I can remember playing pool was with my dad in the arcade in the basement of the Excalibur Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. I was probably 13, I might have been 12. I actually beat him, but only because he scratched on the 8-ball. I was at that point old and or big enough to begin learning to play pool. This brings me to my other truth about pool. Pool felt like it was for wealthier people than me. Or rather, having a pool table was. My interest in the game prompted me naturally to ask my dad, why don't we just get a pool table? After all, my dad had a passion for the game that also went unfulfilled due to his own lack of pool table. Why not just, get one? The answer was that we simply didn't have the space. Our house was too small. Now, this was probably when I was a kid to a teenager. I never would have classified us as poor. After all, that trip to Las Vegas was one of 11 I had before I was even old enough to gamble. Not to mention the 5 trips I had made in those same years to Disneyland. Wealth expresses itself in different ways. However, my dad, in longing for a larger house, always had a room in his dream house's floor plan for a pool table. During college, some friends of mine and I would head to a local bowling alley somewhat frequently and play on the number of bar boxes they had there. But other than that, I didn't have a lot of playing experience. It was just yet another potential hobby I had interest in, but didn't have the space or time or money to do it my way and do it a lot. Fast forward to the pandemic. I'm working from home, sitting on my couch. To pass the time, I have YouTube on and let it do its thing with the algorithm. Somehow I end up on Matchroom Pool. playing modern reruns of 9-ball championships. I am sucked in. What appreciation I had for billiards as a whole merely paled in comparison to what I had now. When the opportunity came up to buy my grandparents' house and keep it in the family, I took it and gained access to a room in which I could maybe fit a pool table. Maybe. This is my grandparents' dining room. Decades of family Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners were eaten and or served here. My insistence to keep this house exactly as it was during my grandparents' time here was met with a minor exception for this room because it was going to be my pool room. But there was only one problem, and that's its size. This dining room is suitable for a pool table along its long axis of some 19 feet or so, but its short axis is lacking at only 9 foot 10 inches. Despite being the same floor plan in theory as both my house, my parents' house, this room is the narrowest of the three houses. Let's talk about pool table math. Assume you're playing a game of pool. The cue ball sits in the side pocket just on the edge. The 8 ball sits across from it just on the edge. You just need to hit the ball straight across and the game is yours. But that puts the cue perpendicular to the long axis of the table and the long axis of the room. A standard pool cue length is 58 inches. Therefore, the minimum width needed for a given pool room is the width of the playing surface plus the length of a pool cue on either side plus room to stroke the cue. The long axis works the same way, but it's not the limiting factor in this particular room. The problem is that if you do the math, the 2 cues alone are 116 inches or 9 foot 8, enough to have a table that is 2 inches wide. That's right. You could take 2 pool cues on either side of this room, point them at each other, butt them up against the wall, and not even have enough space for a pool ball to fit between them. So how on earth do I even begin contemplating buying a pool table? Historically, the ways one can compromise are pretty much owning shorter cues and a smaller table. The championships I had been watching on Matchroom and on YouTube were on 9-foot tables. A pool table has an aspect ratio of 2-to-1. That is to say, it's half as wide as it is long. A 9-foot class pool table has a playing surface of 50 by 100 inches. The playing surface, by the way, is the space between the bumpers, the rails, anywhere a cue ball can land, and you still need to hit it. A bar box, like the coin-op machines you'll likely find in a bar. It's a 7-foot class pool table with a playing surface around 40 inches by 80 inches. 6-foot class pool tables do exist. They're about 35 by 70. However, in my research, a lot of these were MDF playing surfaces as opposed to slate, which is what you're going to find in real pool hall places. And if I could swing a slate pool table, I was going to do that. So my eyes are set on an old bar box pool table, and they are plentiful. Plus, if I secured a bar box, my play would be similar if I went to a bar as it is at home, where jumping between 7-foot and 8-foot or 7-foot and 9-foot tables requires some adjustment. If I got my bar box, my ideal room width would be 40 inches for the playing surface, plus 58 for a cue, plus 58 for a cue, plus 10 inches on either side for stroke, or 166 inches or 13 foot 10. I could get some short cues for the sides of the table. A 30-inch shorty cue nets me 28 inches on either side of the table, bringing our total down to only 110 inches or 9 foot 2 inches. Shorty cues alone would make a bar box work in this room, and knowing that was enough for me to pull the trigger on a table. I found this Playmaster table made in Columbia, Missouri, just an hour and a half outside of St. Louis, for only $30 on Facebook Marketplace. It was admittedly in rough shape. It needed cloth, the veneer was falling off on the sides, and it was in a walkout basement of a house that was in even worse condition, set for demolition in the weeks to follow. If we didn't rescue this Missouri-made piece of pool history, it was doomed to be destroyed. So some friends and I, we loaded up on a U-Haul trailer and drove it home, where we learned that the slate was also cracked, and cracked bad. A long crack stemmed from the ball return area all the way to the center of the table. Using what tools I had at the time, there was little to no hope to repair it. Okay, cool. Don't panic. It's only $30, and it's just a big unusable piece of furniture now stinking up the dining room in your grandparents' house. The way I saw it, I was only $30 in, plus the cost to rent the trailer. Spending money on a great piece of slate would still leave this as an affordable project. I started looking on Marketplace. I don't really use Craigslist anymore. And wouldn't you know it, pool table slates are also very plentiful. The problems I came up against, there were two problems. One of which was that most of the slates you found on Marketplace were for 8-foot or 9-foot tables, and also as such they were 3-piece slate tables. I couldn't cut one of them down if I had the tools. My table is a bar box, and bar boxes typically have a single piece of slate. Mine does. Plus, in my infinite wisdom, I bought a bar box that had a slate that seemed like it was a unique size, so the bar box slates I was finding wouldn't fit. Fast forward a few months, and I found a slate in Des Moines. My dad and I had hopped in the truck, and we made the 10-hour round trip to Des Moines to pick up a $60 piece of slate. So now I can add a tank of gas to the invisible cost to the project, but the table itself only cost me $90. In the months to follow, I would frequently hit up the local pool hall for parts and advice. I got a set of balls. I got brand new cloth. I completely redid the rubber and edge facings on the rails. The table's entire playing surface was getting done up from the ground up. By Christmas 2023, I was able to christen the table in a game with my dad, and it was all right. The shorty cue was not going to cut it in the long term. I needed more room, and I had an ace in the hole. I had a way around it that I knew of before I even bought the table. Enter Scott Crosby. Scott has a YouTube channel on which are various projects and other life experiences, but the one of most interest in this story is his video where he was put in a similar predicament. As Scott puts it, I fell into the same trap as many people before me. I bought an 8-foot table and put it into a basement not even big enough for a 7-foot table. My eyes lit up. I had a 7-foot table in a room that not even wide enough for a 6-foot table. Now, you could stop my video and go watch his and get a lot of the same info you'd get by continuing to watch mine. In fact, find time to watch his video. If you're a hobbyist engineer like me, you know that watching multiple videos of multiple people solving the same problem helps produce the best answer for you. It's a simple concept. Remember that shot in the beginning, the shot from the side pocket to the side pocket that defined the constraints of our room? What is important to realize is that in that hypothetical, I only need to cue on the side of the table where the cue ball is. That is to say, I never need to be able to stroke from both sides at the same time. I need to be able to hit a cue ball anywhere in this room with a full-size cue and a few inches to actually stroke the cue. In other words, forget about the table altogether. Without the table in the way, it becomes clear that this is super possible. So what if, for that shot and that shot only, we moved the table? We moved it towards the wall, giving me more room to use my cue. What if we moved it such that the balls didn't move? And what if we motorized it and taught it where the middle, the left, and the right side of the room is? That's exactly what Scott demonstrates in his video and exactly what I sought to reproduce. I followed Scott's system pretty much to a T. I used right angle iron on the floor and then mirrored a set of angle irons on the bottom of the table with 16 ball bearings between the table and the lower rails. I have no idea what the table weighs, but I've been operating on the assumption it's about 600 pounds. When the table is sitting on the floor with its stock feet, it seems impossible to move just by pushing it. But when the weight is distributed among 16 low-friction wheels with less than 40 pounds on each wheel, it requires far less force to move it. I was able to push this around with one finger And I used a fish scale and determined it took about 12 to 15 pounds of force to move it along the rails. For a while, I just played it like this. I just had to be aware and not lean against the table, otherwise it would move. During this time, it was clear that the championship cloth that I'd gotten had enough, static friction on it to keep the balls more or less in the place they were as it moved. There's a physics equation that one can use to represent this problem. The lateral force of the table accelerating needs only be lower than the force of gravity on the balls and the friction coefficient between the balls and the cloth. Now, the balls will rock back and forth sometimes, but they naturally stay in the same place. But how do I keep the table from moving when I lean against it? The answer is a threaded rod of some kind. This is the same mechanism you can find in a flatbed scanner or a 3D printer. Additionally, mate that threaded rod, which has a known thread pitch, with a stepper motor, which has a known, steps per revolution, and you've got a movement system, just like the one in your 3D printer or your scanner, only way bigger. Just like a nut on a regular piece of threaded rod or a worm drive gear train, the nut on a ball screw or lead screw, the only way to move the nut laterally along the rod is to spin the nut or the rod. Pushing laterally against it, it stays in place. We mount the ball screw to something that is heavy enough to stay in place. In this case, I used a patio umbrella stand, weighs like 40 pounds, a dowel rod, and a 3D printed adapter bracket. If this stays in place, only the table moves. If we know that a single turn of the threaded rod, in this case a ball screw, moves the nut 4 millimeters, we then know, and we know that it takes 400 steps sent to the stepper motor to make one revolution. Each 100 steps we send to the motor results in moving the table by 1 millimeter. I opted for a ball screw that was 48 inches long or 1,200 millimeters long for my table. That is almost the exact width of the bottom of the bar box. This means that if I push it to the absolute extreme, I could get my table to move 24 inches in either direction. As such, this effectively means I have widened my room by virtually 4 feet, which is itself wider than the playing surface. I think I backed it off to 41.5 inches or 1,060 millimeters of total movement from wall to wall, but it's still quite the improvement. Also worth noting was that while I started with an Arduino, and Scott references an Arduino in his project, I made the move to Teensy. Arduinos are great, and I love using them whenever I can. They're affordable, they're easy to program, and easy to integrate permanently into a solution. However, as Zack Freedman has shown me, the Teensy is just so much better in so many arenas, and this is one of them. The Arduino's clock frequency is 16 megahertz. It limits how many steps per second we can send to the motor to about 4,000, which is also the same as saying 10 revolutions per second or 40 millimeters per second. That's the top speed of the Arduino-based system. And going from one extreme, one wall to the other, took about 45 seconds. While it's nice to have that much time between shots, it draws out the length of the game and puts me in a mental position of, is it worth the time to move the table? Or is it worth finding a way to make this shot work where I am? With the Teensy upgrade, my max steps per second was now 300,000 or 75 times more. I did the math, and that means that without adding micro-stepping, if I could build an infinitely capable supply, I could accelerate the table to move up to 30 full meters per second. Obviously, this is insane, and it makes it such that the friction coefficient is the bottleneck, which is to say the acceleration is the limiting factor on how fast this can go. I started with an acceleration of 300 steps per second, and a top speed of 3,500 steps per second, or 35 millimeters per second. After the Teensy upgrade, I upgraded the acceleration to 1,200 steps per second, and a top speed of 6,000 steps, or 60 millimeters per second. At this point, it moves from wall to wall in 23 seconds, or from center to wall in about 13 seconds. This is plenty fast, and it gives people time to move out of the way of the table once it starts to move. At this point, the table is done for now. The Teensy upgrade was perhaps phase 3 of the project, phase 1 being a playable table and phase 2 being a motorized table. There's still tweaks to be made for sure. The balls still slightly shake back and forth when it's moving. The fact that in certain areas of the angle iron, not all 16 wheels are making contact. Maybe a thin but hard rubber or urethane tire to make better contact would fix it, and maybe that would also fix the shaking balls. It'd be cool to find a way to make a proper pool light work. Maybe even one that moves along the ceiling with the table. There may be a better place on the floor for me to lay the rails to keep the table as level as possible throughout its entire travel. There's always ways to keep working on this pool table. Projects are never really ever finished. But for now, it's worth just playing on. Pitch this idea to anyone that had never heard of it, and they'd probably think it's insane, awfully flawed. The answer I got most often was, just get a bigger house. There's some truth to that. It's awfully pragmatic. However, the housing market is insane. I have been very fortunate enough to secure what I have, and rather than trade it all in and increase my mortgage, move someplace else, give up the house my grandparents bought when they started their family, I sought to live within my means, and not just in the typical economic sense, but also in the physical sense. I did something that many thought was impossible, even though Scott Crosby did it first and inspired me to do pretty much the exact same thing. I know from the comments on his video that others have also followed suit. I'm not alone. I'm not the second person to do this either. There will be naysayers, sure, and critics and nitpicks, and some of them may have an answer to this question. But to all of them, I ask, where's your $30 motorized pool table? I hope to produce some sort of repository that has all the files, the source code, the plans, the calculators, the schematics, etc. for my pool table build in the description of this video. As Scott pointed out, it takes several skill sets to pull this off, and there's no one size fits all, so your mileage will certainly vary. But with this, I hope folks are a little less afraid to think outside the box when it comes to making a great game of pool happen in their house. And also, take pool out of the equation. I hope it inspires people to think outside the box for any hobby they want to take up that they don't think they can. However, until the next time, my name is Ty. These are my things.